Yes, thank you very much, Mikhail. Hello, dear friends.
Поняли, зачем мы собираемся защищать и что
Now
мы
that you
собираемся
know
защищать, и
what to
чем
protect
решать
and
вопрос,
defend,
каким образом эти средства
and
безопасности подключить к
the next
инфраструктуре.
question is how do you want to connect your security tools to the existing infrastructure? That's the subject of my presentation. I am Director for Analytics and Integration at Digital Solutions. For many years, like 15 years, I've been into infosecurity and IT, including equipment development and implementation. Now, the first question is, how can we integrate network security tools in your infrastructure? There are generally two ways of doing this. You can install them the way you would usually install NGFW, in between, that is. So this way, for example, you can block, say, an incoming attack as part of the traffic, which sounds great, but there are also difficulties involved here. Such tools will then need to have a high throughput capacity. They will process a lot of traffic going through them, and they should not create too much latency. Another important aspect of such tools is that, they should be like doctors, like, do no damage, do not hurt. I'm sorry, do no harm, obviously. So by blocking some traffic, you can easily hurt the business process. So such tools, they need to monitor a lot, monitor fast, and at the same time, they're not allowed to collect too much information because that will increase latency, and looking for correlations between different sessions will require much more capacity. So the alternative is to connect your InfoSec tools, like that's the second category, is the monitoring tools that will be looking not at the traffic as such, but rather at the copy of the traffic. So you make a copy of the traffic and you send it for analysis. Now, the benefit here is that you should be able to filter out the traffic which you're not interested in, which is a priori safe and secure. And the remaining traffic you can analyze in much more detail. However, on the other hand, it doesn't really help you prevent attacks, right? Just like in that meme where they say that PTNet doesn't block attacks, but it shows those attacks. Why would you need a copy of the traffic back in year 2000? Well, that would be good for selective monitoring and troubleshooting, so the network administrator could understand something about what's happening in their network. In the more advanced organizations, it could be, say, an element of the first IDSs. So network perimeter and high-speed channels could be kind of scraped or could provide you with this copy. So eventually it led to this mirroring function for switches and routers, an auxiliary function which provided some competitive advantages to some vendors and not the others. Why would you need a copy of the traffic today? Well, today it's mostly used to monitor internal traffic and horizontal traffic to, for example, identify the attacks that have already breached the perimeter. So there could be different tools for that, and you will want to have a copy of the traffic for different systems. So the next question is, if we are monitoring all the traffic, looking for threats, and also looking for ways to optimize, say, your operations, well then, the second category tools, they can actually look deeper. So the traffic copy should then be expected to contain pretty much the traffic that you want to analyze. So this is like the basic requirements. Like if there is no traffic, there is nothing for them to analyze. Now, if we consider how many ways there are to collect traffic from your infrastructure, you'll see there are only two ways to this: span ports and finally specialized tab devices. Let's start with span ports.
нужны. Ну, с хорошего. Ну, в целом span-порт — это такая функция коммутаторов.
Now, a span port is a function of switches and routers,
который через этот
which enables the packets going through the device to be mirrored
заданный порт.
and sent to a certain output port, so to speak. Now, the biggest advantage of a span port is that most modern routers and switches have those span ports. In the, going forward, I will be saying switches, but in fact, all devices running on ASIC circuitry, they will meet the same rules, so to speak, will correspond to it. So, routers and switches, they can do some primitive traffic filtering. For example, you can mirror traffic coming from a particular VLAN. This advantage can backfire at times. This is not something that vendors call a filtration function, and therefore, the kind of traffic it will send is pretty difficult to predict because, if it does tagging, for example, the types of traffic it will mirror may differ. So do not rely on it too much. You may discover that not all the traffic from the given VLAN was, in fact, mirrored. Now, let me say a few more words about how it works, what works like inside the switch. So inside a regular switch without a span port, now, all modern switches work in a store and forward manner. So first they get a packet, then they read the header, and based on that, they decide which port to send it to. And while the switch is thinking, the package sits in the buffer. Once the decision has been made, it is added to the queue, waiting for the other packets lined up by that port are dispatched.
То есть там помимо очередь не одна, есть очередь для блатных.
It's not just a single line. There is also like a privileged line. If you are not a privileged packet, you'll have to wait longer.
Вышел на выход, только после этого он удаляется из буфера.
Once he has been dispatched, it is removed from the buffer.
Включается span-порт.
Now, what happens if you have a span port up? Now, the span port is only available for dispatch, while all the other ports are bidirectional. They can be used for receiving and dispatching. And, they will often have 10 by 10 speeds, and we need the 10 gigabit speed. So this tells you that throughput capacity of a span port is twice as low. Now, this leads to accumulation of packets in the buffer. A buffer can be, will reach its threshold, and then some packets will be dropped. Well, first, it's the packets to be mirrored that will be dropped. And it doesn't really matter if these are TCP or IDP packets.
Отправитель получит от своего изначального получателя, должно было уйти на
TCP ACK will be dispatched, but whatever was expected to be sent for monitoring will simply be dropped. Now, if it's like a major issue with throughput, it won't be just mirrored packets that will be dropped, but regular ones will also be dropped, and, connection quality will continue to degrade. Now, this is sort of good because this is something you can instantly notice and address. But the biggest issues you experience happen when it is sort of working, when the average throughput or the average amount of traffic is below your traffic capacity. It's like 5 gigabits in a 10 gigabit channel. However, we do remember that the speed there is 10 gigabits, so if you see 1 gigabit, this means that 90% of the time there is, in fact, nothing being transmitted. So, if you see spikes across some ports, you can easily have localized traffic drops, which are much more difficult to identify and debug. Now, the way vendors talk about it is like this. Let's start with the classics. Catalyst. So here they provide the description of how a packet arrives, is stored in the memory. They also say that you should not exceed the load, and that mirroring reduces the performance. Now let's look at switches, routers.
накручено, есть возможность даже
Now, this is a bit more complex, so you can actually do more sophisticated mirroring here. And note that you are limited here in terms of the amount of traffic you can mirror. They recommend no more than 15%. So you can see that you can use global ACL interface configurations for traffic mirroring. Now, if they introduce this threshold, it probably means they know something about how their systems operate. Sounds like a sensible recommendation. Now, they say that Oriental texts contain fewer figures, but they are equally wise. So Huawei recommends that you disconnect your mirroring function if you're not using it. They do not give you specific figures, but they seem to be generally aligned with the Western manufacturers. And they also say that they say that mirrored packets might be kind of somewhat different from the real ones, and they have lower priority. And they also say that mirroring of output traffic for a given port involves an internal loopback and eats into the throughput capacity for both input and output. Now let's look at Russian equipment. Now the documentation is pretty sparse, and most manufacturers have pretty much the same language there. They say that the throughput capacity of the output port should not be exceeded. Together with an independent lab, we are running a kind of a study into how mirroring is done on Russian equipment. And once the study is over, I think we are going to publish the results on Hubber. So network equipment running on CPUs such as NGFWs, software routers, mirroring for them is particularly sad because it's all done at the software level, which means that you need to sort of exit from the main program in order to do that. So there is a drop in performance there as well, because you gotta save the context, you gotta do this move, so to speak, so you lose time, and it also hurts because you've paid your money for the NGFW, and then you spend, the time of your NGFW doing nothing but packet mirroring. And in terms of architecture, we have a pretty complex network where mirroring is done by various types of equipment. And we also need to make sure that configurations are all the same there, that they stay where they are. And if we do porting or replacement of equipment, configurations are sort of aligned. And also we may experience unpredictable packet losses. Also, we may easily be limited in terms of traffic sources. There will be competition for traffic copies, like which system should be connected to the span port. And then we end up having to send all the traffic to our analytical systems, which means that we won't be making the best use of their capabilities. Now, what about TAP? Well, let me show what it looks like. It's a pretty lightweight device. It's a passive optical device, and it sends some of the photons for monitoring. Now, for monitoring a single link, you will need two outlets. One from A to B, from Alice to Bob, and one from B to A. Now, for a copper TAP device, which is considered an active device, you can off full physics. However, it has an inbuilt bypass. So if something happens, for example, electricity is disconnected, well, it becomes nothing different than a cord or a cable. So it continues to function in a way. So the disadvantage is that a standalone device, it has to be bought, it has to be positioned somewhere. So you got to install it. And if you didn't do it ahead of time as you were building your DC, well, then you'll probably have to suspend operations for some time. However, installing such a device takes like 20 seconds. So you bring all the cables in,
вытыкают с разных сторон и втыкают в
And
вторую
then,
трассу. То есть это достаточно
you
быстро
kind of,
и безболезненно
on
делается.
command,
В
you
самих
reconnect.
загрузителях нет никакой возможности фильтрации, то есть опять
Now, the coupling units themselves have no filtration built into them, which means that you send all the traffic through them. I should
на самом деле
make a note here about the previous presentation related to ICSs.
живут в сетях СУТП и сетями СУТП, и для них
It's a separate sect, right? So, mirroring traffic for industrial control systems is a matter of like a religious strife, shall I say? It's impossible to argue with them. You just need to know which creed they go by. So some believe that mirroring should be done through span, and they say, well, that gives you much higher dependability. Well, because they say every device you're reading is an additional potential point of failure. So they say minimize potential points of failure. So they say, let's do mirroring through span. And in networks where you have loads below 5%, and this is pretty common in industrial networks, you can certainly do that. Now, the second creed states that anything but span should be used in ICS. Interestingly enough, they have the same God, which is reliability, but they say, if you need to mirror traffic, let's go for specialized devices, because switches are there to make sure that the network is up and running. So there are advantages here as well, such as it being independent of the settings of your switch. There is
отсутствуют потенциальные проблемы, связанные с ростом нагрузки, то есть мы добавили
reduplication, so to speak, of your packets, and naturally you do not undermine the performance. So, for example, it may be difficult for you to understand why, everything was fine with your switch like 10 minutes ago, and now it's dropping packets. And after all, not all devices out there in the market actually have span ports. Okay. Since coupling units do not have a mirroring function, you can still, collect the traffic, copy it. What do you do next? Now, we have different sources, and you may simply be short on the interfaces. So you need to reduce the load on your analytical systems and maybe filter some traffic out. And how do you go about different analytical systems requiring the same traffic? It's not just IT people, it could also be InfoSec people interested in it. So how do we split traffic if you have simply too much? Now, this is where another type of equipment comes into play. Network packet brokers. They actually look like switches, but they're in fact very different in terms of their functions. So what they do is first and foremost aggregation. Note that all buffer-related problems are existent, so to speak, here as well. So, for example, if you see a localized spike in traffic, now this spike needs to be stored somewhere. If regular switches have a buffer in, say, dozens of megabytes of size, in our devices, we installed buffers of up to 8 gigabytes. So that, you can easily control for or compensate for spikes. Also, it does filtration and deduplication. So when you start monitoring horizontal traffic, you will see that the same packets will go through different kind of inspection points, and they will be sent to mirroring 2 or 3 times. So obviously there is no new information you are going to get this way. However, you will expend some resources. So such a broker can identify redundant information and do deduplication. And the next function is important if you need to effectively do the load balance. If a single analytical system is not enough, let me give you some examples from real life showing where we used it and how it got integrated. So we did it for a bank. Imagine There are two DCs, and both DCs need to be monitored, and traffic needs to be sent to NTA, to SPTNet, and also a performance monitoring system. It's, in fact, a riverbed device, which is a bit more complex than performance monitoring, but to hell with the differeces.
С резервного отсода это все собиралось,
So the backup DC
по темной оптике
would provide its information for the duplication, then it would be sent over a dark fiber to the main DC, and then it would be collected inside the main DC with the top devices, and then all that would be collated and combined. That enabled us to reduce the workload thanks to deduplication by 30%, and also with filters we're able to filter out all the database backups because they obviously led to spikes, and since everything was being done in the same DC, it was easier to do monitoring and centralized management. Now let me share another story related to a large corporation.
Государственные органы, госструктуры, они очень похожи по своим...
Governmental entities
Прям сказать о том, что это тоже...
are similar to corporations. I was about to call them a corporation, but if you simply look at their infrastructure, you've got no way of knowing which is which, really.
Сбор, помимо этого...
So traffic goes to NTA,
статистики на CM.
and statistics is collected and sent to CM. So also we installed taps,
Между сегментами различной сети на границе...
and in particular, we did it between network segments, at the boundaries, so to speak. And then we would collect everything at the broker level to do filtration and deduplication. And this way, we're able to reduce their total load by 60%.
решить задачу. Энергетическая компания, вот это как раз тот...
This is a power company. This is a case where coupling units were being used for mirroring purposes.
Ответвителей вот медных это то, что они обеспечивают однонаправленную...
For taps. So what's good about those taps is that they help you send information in a single direction.
Обратно трафик не потечет даже в случае...
So traffic will not flow in the opposite direction, even if, say, an administrator makes a mistake. Now imagine that something happens in the monitoring center. Still, unnecessary packets will not go back into your ICS network. So they also installed all sorts of taps on top of them. So because of deduplication, we're able to reduce the workload by about 50%. So such an architectural solution, which is based on taps and network packet brokers, enables you to build a separate independent monitoring network which is simple, easy to understand, easy to scale. For example, if you need to add new monitoring points or new analytical tools, it is so easy to do that. And this way, you can reduce the number of logical points of failure. Well, yes, you are adding some new devices. However, all the equipment you have in this network is easy to control, easy to monitor, easy to inspect, and this does increase the level of reliability. There are no blind spots there is no competition for traffic. Every system gets the traffic it needs in the format it needs, which makes it easier for IT people and InfoSec people to be friends. Because unfortunately, they are often at conflict. So let's build architecture and infrastructure properly, leveraging the modern tools, and we're all going to enjoy it. Thank you very much.